Welcome back to Hot Rod Guy Garage, and this is going to be another budget engine build video on the 2.3 turbo Ford. So follow me along through the intro, and I'll be back. So, alright guys, it has been another week, and I have got the parts that we need to put this 2.3 Ford turbo engine back together that I bought off Facebook Marketplace in the deal. So, let me flip it around, I'll show you what I got, and what we need to do to go forward. So our little engine's still backed up down here. I had bought a full gasket set from Rock Auto. I went ahead and got a new timing belt and component kit. I got our new piston rings right here. These were the only things that were available for those pistons. So these are a moly ring. We will have to probably file these rings and gap them. And I went ahead and got a new oil filter. If anybody don't know, ProTech is made by Wix. This is an older filter, so pre-man filter changeover, so it should still be a good quality filter. And anytime you're going to build an engine like this, the rest of our stuff's bagged up, you know, covered up, so it's still clean. But anytime you're going to build an engine, guys, you need to have a few things handy. First being a piece of paper and an ink pen. That'll come in handy here in just a few moments, but you're going to need something to record all your measurements on this engine. A piston ring filer for a turbo engine, or any kind of build really, guys, you should be set your piston ring gaps. So I have this one right here from Jegs. I've had this thing for quite a while. It's a very nice little unit, works very well. It's just a hand crank style. You want to magnetic dial indicator. This is actually a rear end setup dial indicator and stuff. It will work fine for this application. You're going to need a piston ring compressor. I don't like the old universal wind up ones. Ones like this are very easy to come by and are pretty cheap. And they make the job a lot easier. But as far as specialty tools, this is about all we're going to need, guys. Just these three things. And, you know, you're obviously going to need some kind of sealant, and some kind of sealant. These are three of my favorite things to use when building an engine, so that's what we're going to use on this one. And you need a clean area to work in. Unfortunately, the shop in here is not all that clean, but I did come in here this morning. I cleaned, swept the floor, I blew the floor out. I cleaned my table off over here and laid down some clean towels on it to sit stuff on as we work. So let's get this thing uncovered and get started. So at this point, we got everything unbagged as far as the block goes. I've got some of the stuff over here unpacked that we're going to have, such as our main bearings, our rod bearings, our main studs, our auxiliary shaft and its bearings, you know, our main caps and stuff that are up here in the box. So, before I get started trying to assemble anything, even though this thing's been in a bag, I'm going to take the air hose and I'm going to blow all the oil passages out, once again with some compressed air, just to make sure that there's nothing, you know, in here. So, it just helps make sure that we're as clean as we possibly can be going this far forward. So, like I said, guys, this is just a kind of a preliminary kind of just make sure we don't have anything that's fell dusty-wise down in this thing. As you can see there was something flopped around over there. You just want to take a few minutes, just kind of blow this stuff out and make sure that you don't have nothing just hiding in there. Because you would be surprised how even dirt and stuff can get stuck inside an engine, even with it completely sealed up. And the very first thing we need to do is install these auxiliary shaft bearings. They go in this tunnel in here. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use the same seal driver we used to remove them. But being mindful to line up our oil hole in this bearing. So that's going to be the most important thing, is making sure your oil hole is lined up. And on these, this oil hole is facing this main cap. It gets its oil from the main bearing right here. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time, and the cam bearing, the installer tool would probably make this a little easier. But you can do it this way too. Another thing to note is this rear journal is not grooved like the front one. So if you miss this alignment, you're going to have a bad day. So take your time, make sure it's lined up. And you can take something like this long pick after you push it up there with your fingers. You can push this just to where it started in this journal. And you can use this pick to make sure your oil hole is centered up. So I've got it started in there, and I've got it lined up. You can see it through the fuel pump hole over here on the side over here. So I'm just going to give it some gentle taps. You don't want to have to beat this stuff in there with incredible force, because you will damage this bearing if you're not careful. And you also want to make sure that you center that bearing in that oil hole also. At this point, I think we're pretty good down in there. And anytime you install a bearing like that, you want to take your shaft and you want to make sure that it will slide in this and rotate freely. So we got one in, let's get the other one in, and we'll go from there. So the forward one does have 2 oil holes in it, but the big slot needs to go towards the main hole. So I'm just going to do the same method I used before, except now I can physically see this a lot easier than what I did the last time. We'll get this thing kind of started up in here. Get it squared up. Because that's the other bad thing you can do, is not get this thing square. It's going to go in pretty loose at the first part of it. It don't get tight until you start getting the bore. So you just want to make sure you're going in here square. Get that thing back there lined up with your oil hole. After I knock these in, I'll blow this out really, really well to make sure there's no material from the backside have got into our oil journals. And unlike before, when we couldn't turn this auxiliary shaft by hand, by taking those bearings out, clean them up a little bit, and then putting them back in by hand, we're good to go. So now I need to re-clean this auxiliary shaft. I need to blow these journals out good with some brake cleaner, clean our bearing surfaces, And we'll get the auxiliary shaft put in here first as our first item we're going to install. That right there is where you always clean this stuff back out. No matter how clean it was the first time, don't mean it's going to be clean the second time. You just want to try to make sure that you get this stuff as clean as humanly possible when you install it. And as far as assembly lube, guys, this is one option you can use. I have used this off and on through the years, and was how I was taught to put motors together. It works pretty well, just like, you know, assembly lube. It don't really run off after you put it somewhere. So just gonna lube this stuff up real good with it. I'm gonna get our auxiliary shaft put back in its hole. And possibly completely unnecessary, I'm going to take and I'm going to put some Loctite on our auxiliary shaft retainer screws. And I'm just going to use just a touch of blue Loctite on our clean screws, because I don't want these things to back out, guys. If they back out, you're going to tear your auxiliary shaft up, you're going to lose your oil pump, and it's just going to make a big mess. So these plates only go in one way because these are tapered screws. Or number 3 Phillips. So. I'm going to take and get them started. Your retainer goes in the 12 o'clock position on a 2.3 turbo. We're just going to get them good and snug. They don't have to be overly He-Man tight, but you want to make sure they're not going to come out. Not that the retainer can really escape behind the trim. Let's say trim, the seal plate that goes on top of it, but it's just cheap insurance, guys. You know, it don't cost nothing. You're going to do it anyway. And keeps your auxiliary shaft in place. So the next thing that's going to go on is going to be your cover right here, and it's going to go on in this position right here. And you're going to have 30 bolts right here that I'm just going to paint in the background. Remember, I cleaned them in the other video. I'm going to go ahead and paint them now. We need to dig out our seal for this side. We need to dig out our gasket for this side. And you go open your gasket set and you'll be like, well, what seal goes to my auxiliary shaft? Well, fun fact with the 2.3 Ford, like most vehicles that are 4-cylinder, your crank seal, your auxiliary shaft seal, and your cam seal are all the same seal. So just pick one. So that'll give us that seal. And we're just going to kind of look around down in here until we find our seal for our auxiliary shaft cover. And it looks like this one is one piece with the timing cover up here. So we will probably wait to put the cover on until we get the pieces all together. So I decided not to wait. And these gasket sets, they make these in one piece. From the factory, they would have been 2-piece. So what I done, there's 2 different lower timing cover gaskets for a 2.3. There's a correct one and there's an incorrect one for a turbo engine. And the difference is right here. If you put this style on a turbo engine, you're going to have leaks. So you got to have that one that turns upward. So I took a pair of scissors, I trimmed it up here, and I will trim it across through here a little later. But that gives me my gasket for this, and we can go ahead and get it installed. And some of you might not like that at this point, but it just seems like the easiest way to do it to me. So what I got here is some Permatex high tack, and these things are usually quite the bear to get the lid open on. So yep, it's gonna be fun. All right, so get it open. So what I'm gonna do, guys, this stuff is like a glue and a sealer. It is very thin. So what I'm gonna do, just on the outside of this auxiliary shaft seal, I'm just gonna put a little light band around it, like that. Not only will it help this seal slide in when we install it, and I'm just gonna lightly tap it around the edges, slide in. Sometimes they don't. But just gonna tap that seal in there like that. And I'll take and wipe around this and wipe off any excess around the edge that might have squeezed out. But what it does is, just in case, you know, this don't seal all the way in here. Say there's a little bend in it or an oblong spot. It just helps seal it off. So, got the seal installed. And I'm gonna take and I'm just gonna, once again, I'm just gonna take this. I'm just going to lightly clean our surface up here, trying not to get any on the oil side. This stuff dries very, very sticky. And what it's meant for is to help you install these type of gaskets. You want to make sure your gasket's positioned correctly. You can get it on there, you're going to push it down. And now that gasket won't fall off and you can install it. Some people would RTV this stuff. Something like a high-tech sealant like this, as long as you lightly install it, you can install this gasket dry if you've done a good job cleaning everything up. Or if you're worried about it leaking, you can take and just put you a little bit on this side too. You don't want to put a whole lot because it'll squeeze out and, you know, look ugly. But you can certainly do both sides of your gasket like this. Like I said, don't take much, just a very, 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 very light coat of it. But you do want to make sure anytime you open this stuff, you want to seal it back, because it does dry and it does get very, very sticky. And you can put a little oil on that seal, or some of whatever you're using as an assembly lube on that seal, and it'll push right up on there. So I'm just going to take our bolts, we'll install them, being mindful of making sure that they thread in correctly. I'm just going to take a 1/4 inch drive ratchet, snug these up. And I'm just going to go in here and turn them a little bit until they're good and snug. I'm not going to worry about torquing these. We just want them good and snug. That way we don't have any leaks around our gasket. So, auxiliary shaft is installed. So now that all the auxiliary shaft stuff's inside the engine, our next step is we need to get the main bearings in the engine. So I've got them unbagged. I'm going to clean them up with a little brake cleaner and air hose. I'm going to blow them off, brake cleaner them, blow them off. Make sure they're clean on the front and back. And we'll get them put in the block here momentarily. Alright, so got them cleaned up. I scuffed them with a Scotch-Brite pad just slightly because we did have some rust transfer from our crankshaft, if you remember where this thing from our first video. So these are the original bearings that were in this engine. So I got them cleaned up, got them, these halves installed in the block. Important thing to note, if you have a bearing that is only grooved on one side, that groove goes towards the block. And they only go in one way, because you're going to have a tang right here. You're going to have a corresponding notch in your block on your main cap. And when you install these, I like to kind of roll them in, and then I'll take a small hammer and just lightly tap to make sure these things are 100% flush and 100% seated. So at this point, I'm ready to install the other halves into the main caps. And we need to get our main studs screwed back in the block. And then we can start checking our main bearing clearances. So, like I said, brake cleaner this stuff off, blow it off with air hose, make sure it is clean as it can possibly get. One thing to note, these main caps are numbered, 1 through 5, with your center containing your thrust bearing with the shoulder. So I'm just going to do the same process I did on the block side. I'm just going to get these in there. I'm just going to lightly tap these to make sure they are seated. And then I'm going to set it to the side, or as close to the side as I can. We don't have a big bunch of work room here, so we're just going to get these in there one at a time. Right here is our thrust bearing. You can see it's got a big machine shoulder right here. So this one's going to take our big bearing right here. Just going to slide it in there. And make sure it's flush. But the best you can do to make sure all this stuff's clean, guys, the better off you're going to be. And this is not going to be the only time we're going to install these caps. We're going to install them dry and check our main bearing clearances. And that's part of why we had that piece of paper and a pen at the beginning of the video. Because you want to make sure that everything's consistent. And if it's not, there's a very easy way to kind of get that. And that involves taking our Scotch-Brite again and doing a little scuffing on the bearings. Now, I just scuffed it enough to kind of clean any kind of corrosion off of it, I just want to make sure these were clean, because any kind of dirt that gets in here and any kind of grooves that get in here is pretty bad. So we got those in there. I'm going to get these main studs screwed back in there, and I'm going to put y'all on time lapse for that, and then I'll come back towards the end. Anytime you install an ARP stud into the block side, add thread sealer where necessary, like on a head deck. But like on a main stud, install it dry. You don't want to get it down there and cram it down there with a ratchet. It should be finger tight, guys. If you tighten that stud down in that block tight, it will not torque correctly. ARP has that in all their instructions If you watch some of their videos installing it, they absolutely tell you do not cram these head studs or main studs down in the block. So what I done, hand tighten them. At this point, I'm going to blow the crank off with the air hose and a little brake cleaner. We're going to get it set in the block, so I'll flip it around. So I done blew our crank off in the background, and everybody's been wondering about Daisy. She's here on the floor playing with her toys, having a good time. But I'm going to flip y'all back around right here. We're going to set this crank in here dry. You don't want to use any assembly lube at this point, because we're going to check these bearing clearances. So we're going to set our crank down in here. Like I said, dry. Right here. And I'm just going to take and blow it off again for good measure. Just in case any daisy hairs have blown in the air. I don't want it to get between right here for what we're about to do. So you're going to set your crank in there dry. You want to make sure your oil holes for your mains are offset off to one side. So all these are offset out of the way. So we're ready for our next step. And what we're going to do, we are going to use plastic gauge, check these clearances. This is not a precision race motor, and I don't have any dial bore gauges or any really good quality precision calipers to check any of this stuff. So we're going to go the old school plastic gauge route. This is the assortment kit right here. I got this at Advanced Auto Parts. O'Reilly's does not carry it in the kit that I found. And AutoZone, they look at you like you're a spaceman. So this is kind of an old school way to check your bearing clearances. It will get you very, very close. So let's start doing that. So what I like to do, I will use usually the green as a step on the camera stand. And this gets us to 0.1, 0.3 of an inch. So, you know, each different kind of plastic gauge has a different tolerance range. Your green will get you through most of your stuff. So what I'll do, I'll just take a brand new razor blade and I'll just take and cut this right here across. And inside here we have a little thin wax strip. It will be inside in here. And generally, when you cut this off like this at each junction, you will have enough to do a set of bearings. I don't know if you can see it down there, but it's very, very thin. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take this new razor blade and I'm just going to cut off a very, very small piece. I don't know if you can see it there on my finger. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to bring y'all around here in just a second. I can't do two things at once. And I'm just going to lay this plastic gauge dead in the middle of our crank journal. Down here. You see it right there. Now, what you gotta watch when you have a grooved bearing like this. This bearing's grooved. As you can see, there's still a little rust staining on it. But what you're gonna have to do, you can either use two pieces or you can use one. You may have to offset this to one side to skip your groove. So at that point, we need to find our number one main cap. And on 2.3, they're going to have these little arrows right here. You're going to have a number of arrows. So number one is right here. And number one, the arrow portion of it faces forward. So we're just going to take our main cap and we're going to set it down on there. And ARP specifies to use lube on these, but for our first check of these clearances, guys, I'm not going to lube these yet. and it will slightly affect our torque value. But you don't want lube on the bottom side of your washers. And this is the easiest way to keep from getting it all nasty. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take the screws down by hand right now. And I'm going to take a ratchet and I'm going to snug them up. I'm going to go collect the torque wrench in the background. And we'll come in here and we'll torque this. And we'll check our clearance. So on the 2.3, ARP recommends using the factory main bolt specs on these, which is 80 to 90 foot-pounds. So I got it run down with a ratchet by hand. I'm going to go in here and torque it. But we're going to torque it evenly on both sides. I'm just going to ease up on it. And once we get it torqued, like that right there, I am just going to use this to break it back loose in reverse. Set our torque wrench off to the side somewhere, like right here. We're going to screw these off. Now these engines from the factory had pretty tight oil clearances. Something you don't normally see in a performance-based engine, as these were intended to be. So we're going to compare what the factory specs are. But anytime you do this, we're going to make sure you do not turn this crankshaft. And once you get that these bolts torqued, sometimes you might have to lightly tap these out because they fit down in the register of this crank pretty tight. Right in here in this block, they fit down pretty tight in that register. So what that plastic gauge does, it smushes out right here when you tighten this down. And you're just going to take this and you're going to find the one that matches best on this little chart right here. So we are right at 0.002. So I want to place on the bearing, and it looks like we're right at 0.002 on the piece that's on a crank. So I'm going to bring you in here to what I have wrote down right here. These are desirable specs from Ford. So 0.008 to 0.0015 on the mains. We're at 0.002. For a performance application, you're going to want to run it on this looser side right here. So we're at 0.002. So we're allowed up to 0.0025. So for what we're going to do, I do believe it's going to be fine. So I'm going to repeat this process, guys, all the way back. I'm going to check every single one of them. And when we do the rod bearings, I will do the exact same thing. We will check every single one of them. But you're going to have to get this plastic gauge off, guys. And the easiest way I found is just take your fingernail and just kind of scrape it off and try to get it off like that right there. And I'll come in here with a towel and I'll do the same thing with my fingernail. That's kind of not enough to tear the bearing up, but just enough to kind of scratch it off. And since this is a wax-based product, you can take something like brake cleaner on the towel. And I'll wet the towel a little bit. And I'm just going to wipe the journal off. I'm going to wipe my bearing off too, just to take any kind of remaining residue off. If you were worried about it being inconsistent, especially with a factory motor that's been run, you're just bearing slapping it, this crank appears to have been turned. You could lay 2 small pieces on each side of your groove on your bearing. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to go down through here and I'm going to record every one of our measurements as we go. And we're going to dry mock this up like this on the mains first, and then we'll go from there. So, everything checked out good. Everything checked out pretty consistent. So, what I do when I build an engine like this, I'll go through here and I'll record all this stuff. And what that does, if I ever end up selling this engine, I can show that I went through the process of checking it and make sure everything was correct. So, at this point, we got the crank cleaned back up. I need to pull it back out. We put some assembly lube on the bearings. And then we can put the crankshaft back in. And at this point, you may think you're done with the crankshaft, and you're not. You need to check the thrust play in this crankshaft. And what I was always taught is you take a dead blow like this. You'll smack the front of this crank. You'll come back here and you'll smack the back of it forward. You'll repeat this a couple times. And now we can set up a dial indicator to check the thrust play. Alright, and what you want to do, you want to set up a dial indicator, something like this. This one isn't as precision as what's needed to measure a thrust clearance, but it will give us a good idea if we have too much or not enough. If your thrust clearance is too tight, you will end up like this little 308 that I just released a video on, and it will smoke the thrust bearing out of it. So what I'll do, I'm going to bring y'all back now, and I'm going to try to get everything in one shot. I've got our dial indicator zeroed. On these, the clearance spec on a 2.3 Ford is 0.004 to 0.008. This reads in tenths of thousandths. So we should have some movement, and we may have to adjust our indicator where it's at, make sure our crank is all the way forward. So when our crank's all the way forward, we will zero this gauge out. And then I'll just take a screwdriver on the back side and I'll simply push it back. So looks like we're about 4.5 thousandths, and that is well within spec. So what I'll do, I'll pull it back forward, make sure our gauge is zeroed again. And that puts us a little over 3 thousandths. But if I take the front screwdriver out, it goes to 4 thousandths. So we're right on the tight side of the spec, which is 0.004, which is 4 thousandths. So we should be good. And if you don't have a dial indicator guys, just take your 2 screwdrivers right here and just make sure this thing don't have an excessive amount of play. You want it to have a little, because if it don't have a little, and what I can hear is just the oil where we put that assembly lube in there and just hear it moving back and forth. So not enough to visually with your hands to move it for clearance, and not tight enough to bind up like our little Ford 308, but we're right on the good side of spec. So like I said, this little jigs, I bought this to set up rear ends with. This is actually a rear end setup tool, check pinion depth and stuff. But it's a very nice piece. It's got enough adapters and things that you can attach this even with a pair of vice grips to your engine stand or to a bolt or whatever. It's good for checking stuff like that. And it's like I said, they're fairly expensive. I think I gave like 30 something bucks for this about, I don't know, 8 years ago now. So you may think we're ready to slap rods and rings on pistons and rods in the engine. That's not the case either. We're going to have to check the piston ring gap. And especially since this is a new set of rings, we definitely need to check the piston ring gap. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to roll this motor over. We'll roll it 180 degrees upside down. I'm going to get my bench cleaned off over here. I'm going to get our rods and pistons out. And I'm going to get our new rings opened up. And we'll start delving in what you need to do, especially on a turbo engine and natural aspirator or nitrous engine. You need to check this stuff regardless, guys. What it takes to check ring gap and what we need to do and how we need to set it for various applications. All right. You want to open up your piston rings, and they're going to come either bagged in something like this or wrapped in paper like this. 1, 2, and 3. This corresponds with the ring grooves on your pistons. 1 being the top one, 2 being the middle one, and 3 being your oil ring. You want to get your instructions out, guys, because this tells you what direction these rings go. Some of these rings are tapered. Some of them have grooves. Some of them have tabs. Some of them have dots on them. And all those are very important in relation to how these rings are made, because some of these rings are tapered on the inside to allow gases and stuff to escape between it and your piston itself. So always make sure you read your instructions. This will be about the only time I'll ever tell you that in my life. But make sure you read your instructions. And if you don't speak English and you're watching this with subtitles, your piston rings are going to come with all different kinds of languages and instructions. So no excuse not to read them. But in this video, as far as working with these piston rings, we are just going to focus on the number 1 compression ring, which will be your top ring, and our number 2 compression ring. The oil ring clearances, guys, if you're really mega anal, you can check these. Generally, out of the box, they're great. If you're going to order an oversized set of rings, say you got a standard bore engine, you order a set of 10 over rings so you can file fit them. You definitely want to check the oil ring clearance too. Can't forget about that. And all those specs can be easily found online, especially for a 2.3 Ford. 90% of people refer to this as a 2300. If you type in 2.3 Ford, it's going to take you to the new EcoBoost stuff. We're not all about that, so that's why I'm sharing these specs as we go. So what we're going to start out with is our second rings right here. And we're going to have 4 of them. These are going to be a cast iron ring. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take our package that come in right here. I'm going to set it down on the table and set the rings on top of it. And I'm going to take this ring and I'm going to look and see if there's any taper or marks like our instructions say. And this one right here, I know you probably can't see it on camera, but there's a dot in it right there. That dot goes upward. And I'm also going to open our number 1 set of rings, which will be our top compression ring, because these are what we're worried about in this application, is our compression rings, because we don't want these rings to butt. In a turbo forced induction or nitrous car, if these ring lands hit from the heat, they expand when they get hot and this gap goes away when it's down in the bore. If these butt, these will go away. It'll bust them off the piston. So you want to keep in mind what your application is. If you're going to build an NA motor and run it, you want things a little on the tighter side. If you're going to build a nitrous or a turbo car, you want things a little on the looser side. The downfall of that is, if you put it together tight, it will last a very long time. But if you put it together tight and you put nitrous or forced induction on it, like a turbo or supercharger, and you start beating on it, before this thing's good and wore out, you're going to hurt it. So our top ring also has a dot that faces up. And this being a moly top ring, you can see the coating on the edge. versus our cast iron second ring. You can see the color differences in these rings. So let me run the math and get our specs for an engine with this bore size, and I'll show you the differences between applications. Alright, the easiest way for me to explain this, I'm going to do this in per inch of bore. So you need 4 thousandths on an NA application. This is going to be a high performance naturally aspirated application. Something you're going to beat on a little bit. You want somewhere around 0.4 thousandths per inch of bore. You know, a high RPM engine, something you're going to run hard for a long period of time, say a dirt track or something. You're going to want somewhere around, you know, 4.5 thousandths per inch of bore. Say a nitrous, you're going to want somewhere around 7 thousandths per inch of bore. And turbo car, you're going to want to stay somewhere around in here. The safe bet here is just go 0.008 thousandths per inch of bore. And when you do the math on a 2.3 turbo, a 3.780 is a stock bore, and then we got to add 20 thousandths because our block is 20 over. That makes us a 3.800 bore, and at 8 thousandths per inch, we need a 22.8 thousandths ring gap. So we're going to be right at 23 thou. So the math's real simple on this, guys. You're just going to take this number, multiply it by your bore diameter, and that'll give you your number that you need to shoot for. Ford spec on a 2.3 turbo is between 10 thousandths and 20 thousandths. And there is a little change. You usually gap your second ring a little wider, say. But Ford spec, like I said, it's 10 to 20 thousandths. Because they're not expecting somebody to beat on these things all the time. So, say we're at 23 thousandths on the top ring. These are all top ring numbers. You'll add like 1 to these as you go for your secondary ring. So, with 23 thousandths on top, I would like to probably be somewhere between 25 and 26 thousandths on the second ring. If I set it up for kind of a max use turbo application. Hopefully you understand that. But you can Google it, guys. It's very simple. Different ring manufacturers, different materials have different, you know, recommendations. Generally, just about everything's going to be, if it's going to be a max effort turbo engine, you're going to be somewhere in the 20 to 30 thousandths of ring gap range. Maybe a little more with a big bore, maybe a little less with a small bore, if that makes sense. So, I got the Ford specs, we got our calculated specs, and what we need to do, we need to get ours measured and see where they're at out of the package. If we're lucky, we won't have to, you know, gap any of these rings. You never know. Aftermarket rings, the consistency of them is so far off that you never know. And guys, these dark spots in here are just where the assembly lube has run down off our crankshaft a little bit. A lot of people don't take ring gap serious, and that is why a lot of people end up blowing up their engines. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take these second rings. These are our second compression rings. I'm going to make sure our dots are facing upward. And I'm just going to sit it down here in the bore. And I'm going to repeat this for all 4 of these rings, because we're going to check all 4 of them at the same time. It just makes it faster. It'll make it easier for me to show you consistently what we have going on. And we just want to kind of just get them in the bore down there. And we're going to take one of our pistons, and I'm just going to take this and eyeball it, and I'm going to push it down to where our second ring is sitting. I'm just going to push it down to the bore a little way until it's good and flush. It don't matter if you go a little further on some or others, but you just want to make sure you push this ring down evenly, because it's going to mess with your ring gap measurements. So once you get that in there, what I've done here, I've got a 20 thousandths filler gauge. This is going to be our go, no-go gauge for the Ford spec. A 20 thousandths is actually loose in between all these rings. So I'm just going to scroll through, computer pun there. I'm just going to scroll through. I'm going to get a 24 thousandths out here. I'm just going to, you want a filler gauge, you want it to have some drag when you run it between these. So these are literally 24 thousandths on their second ring. So brand new out of the box ring, guys, and this motor has not been run since it was bored. At least that I could tell. We're already above factory specs and we should not be there. But that's good for us because we're not going to have to file any rings in this case. And I'll take about 2 thousandths away from what the ideal ring gap is, especially on a fresh engine like this and a fresh ring, because these are going to wear in as you run the engine. And we're not going to beat on it straight out of the gate. So we're going to repeat the same thing with our top rings. Just going to put these in here. These moly top rings are a little stiffer. And a lot of people don't like a moly ring in a turbo application, but I personally prefer them. I've always had good luck with them. Without any issues. So just gonna make sure all our dots are up, and I'm gonna follow the same signs here I did with the other one. I'm gonna push this down here in the bore a little bit, just where we can get a consistent measurement between these rings. Don't worry if you go down a little further than the rest, as long as that ring's square in that bore. So I can already tell you that it looks about the same to me, which would be ideal for a quick assembly. Gonna be a little on the loose side, and they are definitely tighter than 24 thousandths, but I do see a pretty decent air gap in them. So let's drop back to a 20. So we got a 20 thousandths on the top ring and 24 on the secondary ring. So what you're gonna do, you're gonna secure this well. That way you don't do what I just done. But you're going to come in from this side right here where we get this good flat spot. You're going to butt your ring up to those two tapered screws up there, and you'll squeeze it lightly, and you'll spin this. And what this does, now it takes a little bit of time because it's not going to be a consistent amount of time you're going to do this, but you're just going to lightly squeeze that ring so it's square, and you're just going to take and turn this. You can hear it. And you're just going to, you know, work it by hand until you get your desired ring gap. And you'll have to measure that every single time. Another trick, if you wanted to file fit your rings, because this motor was 20 over, you could have bought a 25 or a 30 over set of rings if they were available. In this case would be a 30 over set of rings. That's going to make the ring 10 thousandths bigger. So it would have took 10 thousandths out of our gap. And then we could have file fitted them exactly to the bore and 100% knew that it was 100% perfect. Same goes with standard board, guys. You can get a 5. Sometimes you can get a 5 or a 10 over ring. You can do the same thing. File them, make sure your gaps are right. This is the easiest way to gap rings, and I've had this for a little while. And unfortunately, I've not used it a whole lot because most of the time these aftermarket rings have always been large. I'm not a fan, especially on Turbo LS stuff. People will reuse factory rings. I'm not a big believer in that because they do lose tension. And a lot of people think that your ring gap is what causes blow by or an engine to start smoking, and that's just not the case. It does have a factor in it, guys, but a lot of that factor is these things lose their tension. You gotta think, it's a spring. A piston ring is a spring, and its job is to stay tight to that bore, and over time they lose tension, and you'll start getting some oil consumption or a little blow by. And another way you can get it is they wear the grooves out in the pistons, and it'll let that ring flutter. When I say flutter, it'll let it chatter back and forth in those ring grooves. So it's always a good idea, if you're going to pull one apart, guys, go ahead and put new rings in it, especially if it's been run a considerable amount of time. So now we need to dry fit our pistons and check our rod bearing clearances. And then we're pretty close to actually assembling this thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to flip this upside down because our pistons with no rings will fall out. So I'm going to turn it on its side so the piston's vertical. Or horizontal, sorry, not vertical, horizontal. That way I can take and feed this piston in this bore with no rings, and I can work right here and guide everything safely around these rod journals, and then we can get in here and torque it and check our specs. So just like the main bearings, I'm just going to take these rod bearings, even though they look good, they have just a little transfer and scuffing on them from where this thing sat. It was turned over. I'm just going to take and just lightly hit them. I'm not bearing down on these, and I'm not really hurting them at all. I'm just making sure that we have a nice consistent surface without removing material. We're pretty much just polishing the coating on them. We're not removing it at this point. I'm just going to take this and do this to all these rod bearings. I'm going to spray them off and blow them off with a little brake cleaner and air hose. And same with our rods and pistons. I'm going to blow them off. Make sure where these bearings sit in our rods are good and clean. Then we'll take our plastic gauge and we'll check these clearances just like we did on our mains. So I'll be back here in just a moment, guys. I just want to let y'all know that me doing this is absolutely not hurting anything. I've seen some people on coated bearings polish the coating off with Scotch-Brite. You can change clearance slightly with this, depending on how long you do it. But I'm just doing it to make sure we're back at ground zero where we started, considering we're reusing these bearings that were already in this engine. Well, I got all our bearings and rods and pistons cleaned up. I just take a piece of small fuel line hose like this and I'll barely screw it on the end. I like them to fit pretty tight. And what I'm going to do, you need to make sure that you put these in the cylinders that they go in. Like these are marked 1 through 4. So this be cylinder 4. So we're going to check cylinder 1 and cylinder 4 first. And it's going to be a little bumpy ride here a little bit for a moment, folks. But what we're going to do, we're going to go in here. You got a notch on your piston. That notch faces forward. I'm just going to slide this thing in here dry. Push our piston down till we get it up against the crankshaft. I'm going to take that off. I'm going to take our rod cap, and these rod caps only go in one direction too. And most of the time they're going to be stamped on the same side with the number. I'm just going to get a rod bearing and make sure everything's kosher right here. And I'm going to have to pop it back apart, because at this point we're ready for our plastic gauge. But I'm just going to do this with cylinder 1 and 4. And we'll get our plastic gauge and then we'll be back. So, once you get your plastic gauge cut, and I just done it like we did on the main bearings. I stuck a little piece in here. As you can see, it's not going to fall out. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to gently slide a rod cap on here, making sure our plastic gauge don't fall out. Put it up in there like that. I've got our bolts on here, our nuts, and we'll run them down. These will go a little faster, and some people might try just to go ahead and put the rings on it and start putting it together, but if you put any kind of assembly lube between this, you're going to get a false reading. So, that plastic gauge will stick to that bearing enough for you to get it up in there. So I'm just going to take these one at a time. I'm going to torque them down. Then we'll pull them back loose, measure our clearance, and record it. Then we'll pull these back out and get all the rings installed and start lubing stuff up. So, rod bearings on a 2.3 turbo, torque between 30 and 36 foot-pounds. The torque spec does have a little play on clearance. So I'm torquing these to 35. But you want to be consistently and even when you torque them. I always like to go over things a couple times just to make sure stuff's even. Once they're torqued, we'll just take these back loose. We'll measure the clearance on these two. And then I'll rotate this crankshaft so cylinders 2 and 3 are down. That's the only good thing about a 4-cylinder. You can do pretty much just these in 2 shots, guys. Because 2 throws are down, 2 throws are up at all times. A V8, you would do opposing cylinders at one time. It makes this process just a little harder. But you still need to check regardless, whether you use a dial bore gauge and a quality micrometer to measure your crankshaft and your inside diameter of your bearings, or if you do it like I'm showing you right here with plastic gauge, you need to take the time and make sure that you at least have clearance. I have seen bearings packaged in correctly. I have seen people throw them together and trash a good motor for absolutely no reason other than an extra maybe hour's worth of work in total. So, there. Looks like we're about 2 thousandths on the rods also on these two. And this is one of them cases where they're kind of in between, guys. It's not dead on, and that's what you're going to run into with plastic gauge right here. When you get to kind of in between, it's going to, you know, read a little funny. So you just kind of gotta estimate the best you can, you know, but we're pretty close to 2 thousandths of clearance. So I think it'll be okay. It's a little on the tighter side of spec because Ford's a 0025 to 0030. We're about 0020. And there's a couple of ways you could make it a little wider if you wanted to. The thing with this, with the clearances being a little on the tighter side, we'll be able to run thin oil and have better oil pressure. So they're not tight enough to cause any concern. This may just not be an engine that you want to start bouncing it off the rev limiter straight out of the gate, if that makes sense. So we're still well within spec. We're just on the tight side of spec on the rods. So we'll be okay there. So let's check the other two. So we're now got all the clearances checked, and the other two rod bearings were consistent with the other two. So we're on the tight side, which is good for oil pressure and really good for longevity. We just really don't need to beat on this thing straight out of the get-go. So at this point, we're ready to get our pistons prepped. And what I done, I come in here, I put some lube on the wrist pins. You want to make sure these things are lubed up good, guys, because after you clean this stuff, if you run this engine with no lube on these wrist pins, there's a good chance that it could lock up on startup. So you want to make sure you got these things oiled real good, or use a good assembly lube and get it in there and just work these back and forth. There's a couple of oil grooves on each side of the piston in here. You can put some down in there and work it around. But you just want to make sure these things are well lubed down there. So I've already done it to all 4 pistons in the background. So at this point, we're ready for our piston rings. And when you put a piston ring on, they sell a piston ring installer. You can use those that spread the piston rings open. I'm personally not a fan of them, because if you don't know what you're doing, you can damage the rings. But what we're going to start off with is our oil rings, and we're just going to go one piston at a time here. And for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to set these right here. Now, we got 1, 2, and 3. 3 is going to be your oil rings. So, what you got to think of these rings is 1, 2, 3. So, what I usually start out with, this is an expander grease. Gonna be one of those days. And that's something you don't want to do. Right there. You do not want to pitch your rod caps and bearings off your rod. So what I done, I just stick the rod caps back on these pistons on the connecting rods. So you're going to start off with your expander groove. And it's going to go in here. And it's just going to sit in here. You want to make sure it does not overlap. It's got a little groove cut out in it right here. You can see it. You just want to make sure it sits flush with itself. And in here, these are scraper rings. And you're going to have one on the top side of the expander ring and one on the bottom side. So what I like to do, I'll take these. I'll note where our groove's at in this. And I will take and the spiral these around pistons very gently. Make sure we don't hurt anything. And I'll put one groove on one side. And over here. I'll 180 degree it. And I will put our other one on the other side. But sometimes what will happen when you put these things in here, they'll jump over right here. So that's something you're going to have to watch when you put your scraper rings on. So you may have to get in here and you may have to take these back off. Point being, guys, is what I'm getting at is you want to be very adamant about what's going on. You want to watch what your stuff's doing, because I have seen people take and get this stuff all screwed up in here, and you end up forcing these pistons down in the bores. And what happens then is this expander or scraper ring right here can fold up in here or fold down and get jammed in here and tear your cylinder walls up. So you just want to make sure you stagger your gaps in them. I've seen people line these up. The purpose of these scraper rings is to scrape the oil off the cylinder walls. The more oil they can scrape off the cylinder wall, the better it's going to be for oil consumption. So we get those on there. Like I said, these have a dot on them, and the dot goes up. This is our second compression ring. It's our second ring. And I'm just going to spiral it on there like that right there. And I'm going to stagger it away from that top oil ring. The top scraper ring is right there. Our groove is over here. And then I'm going to take our compression ring, or top ring, and the dot goes up. I'm just going to spiral it on like this. And I'm going to offset it 180 degrees from that oil ring, or second compression ring. So what that does is ensures that you're not going to have any rings lined up, because if these get around in here and line up right here, you're going to have compression problems. You can kind of see what's going on here. You don't have a positive seal, but if you offset all these grooves at, 1,000 times per second or whatever, or 1,000 revolutions per minute, let's just say that, it's going to create an air seal, basically, an air and oil seal in here. And that will seal these rings off. So you want to make sure all these rings are staggered to a point where it does that. So I'm going to put you guys on time lapse. I'm going to get the rest of the rings on these pistons, and then I'll be back. So now that we got all the rings on the pistons, we're almost ready to put the pistons in the block. And one thing I've always done, and I'll always lube my cylinders first before I even start getting the ring compressor and stuff out, I usually just take a little transmission fluid, guys. And that's what I'll use to lube the bores up. I'll just put a little on a white towel and go in here and just kind of give it a little light wipe down. And I've done them this way for years, and I've got kind of a little special mixture of this stuff at the house that I use for this case. But I didn't bring it with me to the shop, so I'll just kind of go in here and put a little bit of transmission fluid on this towel and go in here and make sure our bores are lubed up good with it. And it's also a good way to make sure the bores are good and clean still, because transmission fluid is a good cleaner. I'll do it like that and make sure they're good and lubed up. And on the same front of things, I'll go in here and I'll take whatever I'm using assembly lube. Like I said, I've used STP on and off for years with good results. It works just as good as any other engine assembly lube and actually stays on stuff too. It's been kind of an old school trick, and I'll go in here and I'll go ahead and put some on these crank throws. Because let me tell you, you can never, ever put too much assembly lube on something as far as an engine, especially on moving surfaces. Because, you know, if this thing sits on the engine stand for a couple months, we want to make sure it's got more than plenty of oil in it. Or more than plenty of some kind of protection on everything. And one way to do that is to, you know, assembly lube. So what I'm going to use is my piston ring tool that's sitting right there. This is a performance tool, meaning you can get it at O'Reilly's as a rental tool, or you can buy it from them. These things are fairly inexpensive. Your part number's up here. These have bands that just about cover every kind of engine that you'd ever need to, except for Geo Metros. So if you got a really tiny bore, guys, you're gonna have to use one of them old crappy wind-up ones. And I'm sorry about the kind of blurriness in here. My phone camera's got a little smuts on it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take that piston ring compressor. I'm going to put it over these piston rings while I make sure everything's staggered. I'm going to go ahead and get it clamped down. I'm going to go here and I'm going to lube our rod bearing up real good. And I'll put y'all back on the big stand during this process. I'll put 1 or 2 pistons in real time, and then I'll fast forward to some time-lapse stuff. Just kind of cut a little time here because this video is going to probably be pretty long. So let me flip it around. So I'm going to try to shoot the widest view here I can. So the volume may get a little low at times, but what I'm going to do, I'm not going to fall over the engine stand. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take our number 1 rod and piston. I'm going to put our little rubber booties over our rod bolts down here. I'm going to take and make sure our rings are good and staggered. Some people isn't going like this, but I'm going to take this transmission fluid and I'm going to pour some around these rings. The way they get down there around in grooves. I'm going to take our piston ring compressor and spread it open. I'll make sure it's on there. I'm going to take our pliers right here. I'm going to make sure they're locked down. I'm going to get our lube here. This is going to be kind of a three-handed show here. So I'm going to get our lube. I'm going to lube our rod bearing up. I'm going to wipe my finger off. I'm going to take our rod and piston, make sure our notch is facing forward in here. As your notch on your piston always faces forward, I'm going to take our hammer and then tap our ring compressor around through here. I'm going to watch through this hole where our rod is and how close it is to the crankshaft. And I'm just going to take and just keep an eye on both sides until it goes in there. The good thing on 2.3 Ford, you can get it in the bore without it touching the crankshaft 100%. As long as the crank is turned downward. So from there, I'm just going to take a little wooden handled hammer. I'm going to tap it in there, and that rod and piston's installed. So I'm going to put you guys on time lapse. We're going to do the other 3. You kind of get the gist of what's going on, hopefully. So, got all the rod bolts torqued to 35 foot-pounds. All the mains are torqued, all the rods are torqued. And you always want to make sure, guys, that when you do stuff like this, that this engine turns smoothly when you do it. Return good and smooth with just the drag on the rings. So you want to make sure when we're going to do this, we're going to check top dead center too on this as we go. We're going to get this thing at true top dead center when we go to put all the front accessory stuff on. But at this point, we're ready to roll this thing over and get the oil pump, dry shaft, and pickup tube on here. And then we can get the front timing cover on, and we can put the oil pan back on it. So just go slow, guys, and always double check your work. Measuring everything or plastic gauging everything is a good way to keep tabs on yourself. And not only that, you know what you're working with in the end, and you'll know what kind of oil you want to run and everything via your bearing clearances. So let's get this thing rolled over and get oil pump in it. All right, and if you remember, I've already cleaned our oil pump up and I'd already installed some oil in here. But what I'm going to do before I install this, I am going to take some of this STP because it's super thick. It likes to stick to stuff. And I'm just going to put a little bit inside this pump just to try to help this thing maintain a little bit of lube inside this pump before we torque it down, and some of it's going to run back out, but I just want to get it kind of worked in between right there. And I just want to make sure, like I said, I just want to make sure this thing's well lubed. It will get in there and it will stay between some of these pieces. I'm just going to wipe some of the mass off up here at the top. There's still more than plenty on it. Just going to take our top plate, get it put back on there. And we are going to prime this engine before we start it, but you know, it never hurts, guys, to be a little extra cautious when it comes to this stuff, especially, you know, when you're reusing things. I'm just going to use this just to run these just a little overhand snug. We are going to torque these top plate bolts once we get it in the engine. But on a 2.3 Ford, if you got the distributor out of it, this can fall out. This is not going to stay in your oil pump. However, you can drop it in from the top side and it's not going to fall into the oil pan either. So that's a good thing about these. So when we're done rolling this thing upside down, I am going to put this in the distributor hole. But let's get this oil pump. Now we got a little lube in it. I'm going to turn it upside down, just like it's supposed to go. We got that lube in there. And let's get it on the engine. The oil pump, it's going to go right here. Super simple, guys. The only good thing about these engines, they are fairly simple. Most of your Ford V8 stuff is, most of your Ford 4-cylinder is, especially this older stuff. It's a lot better quality than some of this new garbage you get. This little engine, it's a tank. So just want to make sure we can get to everything before I get all this bolted down. And going to have to pull this bolt off right here, off the mains. Because the oil pump pickup will not go on once you get in the car. Or at least I couldn't get to the bolts back here. It got a weird funky 12-point ARP headed bolt in it. So I'm going to try to just do it this way. That's what you run into sometimes when somebody's already been in there. So I got our new pickup tube gasket installed right here, and I torqued these little ARP bolts to 20 foot-pounds, so that's what they call for. So there's some kind of interferencey thing going on here. Let's see what we got. Looks like even though they cut the pickup tube bracket off, they still missed it by a little bit. So let's see if we can flex this little guy forward just a touch. Looks like it was. That's what happened, guys. You get into somebody else's project here. There it goes. The only good thing about a 2.3 oil pump, they do have a dowel pin that they ride on. So you got that. As long as it rides down on your dowel pin, you're good. Just gonna use a little 3/8 impact to nudge these bolts down a little closer. I'm not gonna tighten them down quite yet. I want to make sure that we don't have no issues with that oil pump sitting flush. I really don't like what they had going on here, so just want to make sure, just kind of run it down, take a second to evaluate things and how things look and what our clearances is around everything. And we can go from there. As long as our oil pump is sitting on that center dial and it sits flat on the block, we will be okay. So I think we're good at sitting flush there. So I think we'll go ahead and torque this oil pump down. Before we mess with the other. I really didn't want to mess with this oil pump pickup too awful much. Oil pump on these torqued like 22, 25 foot-pounds. Because I've got such a long extension on it, I'm going to pull this one to 30 because you lose quite a bit of torque in an extension, guys. So I just want to pull this down with my hand first and make sure everything's kind of kosher. Then I'll just come in here and torque that. Make sure everything still looks okay, because that's the last place you want to have an issue. And to be honest, I would have put a set of stock main bolts back in this, but I didn't feel like tearing another engine down for them. I really don't like this whole arrangement with the pickup tube. torque back. Everything looks okay. Don't like nothing in a bind or anything. So I think at this point I'm going to take my nut driver and run that oil dry shaft up in there and make 100% sure we don't have no binding in the oil pump, which I don't think we're going to, and we don't. Everything turns good and smooth. No issues there. So. That's good and positive. So now we need to torque these bolts right here. Like I said, the spec I found was 5 to 8 foot-pounds. They are a pretty small little bolt. We'll shoot for 8, and I'll torque these in a crisscross pattern. Eight foot-pounds is a whole bunch of nothing, guys. So the oil pump's installed. So we're at the point where we need to put the front timing cover on. And like I said, all 3 of these seals are the same. The cam, the crank, and the auxiliary shaft. I went in here and cut that timing cover gasket down over here. That way it'll look a lot better. And I'm going to do this seal just like I did the auxiliary shaft. I'm just going to take a little of this high tack. Just going to run just a little bit around it. And I'm sure if you probably say this is a waste of time. It's just preventative maintenance. It's not going to hurt anything. It just makes me feel better about installing it. Because that's the way I've done it forever at this point. So, I'm just going to take our seal driver. I'm going to get a towel because our hammer is now, a little funky. Take our seal driver and drive that dude down in there because you can't get a hammer down in there to do it. So got it installed. Before I put this on there, I will put a little lube in between here. But I'm just going to do this gasket just like I did the auxiliary shaft gasket. I'm just going to put a little bit on here. Don't take much, just you're just using it to stick that gasket and maybe, provide a little bit extra sealing help. Just gonna sticky do it down like so and hold that down. I'm just gonna get this a little touch more. I'm just gonna put it on the back side of a gasket. Using something like this, guys, is a lot nicer than RTV in some situations because you know it's going to help it seal, but you know it's going to come off a little bit easier when you take it off. And it's not going to get all up in your oil passages and cause problems and tear stuff up. So, got that on there. Need to dig our bolts out and bolt it on. So, got a little of our STP on our finger. I'm just going to put that up here on the front of this crankshaft up here. And I will have to take this bolt washer out for our balancer / crank pulley because our seal won't pass over it. So I'll take that out. We'll get our cover on there. we'll get to going. So, got our bolts. This will just slide up on there, guys. It's not a real hard fit. There is a little wiggle in this gasket, and you want to make sure that when you tighten this thing down, that it's flush with this block up here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take and run these down. I'm going to get my 1/4 inch ratchet, and we'll snug them down. And there is a torque spec for these. I personally just make sure they're level here on both sides. You don't want to push up or pull down on it because you'll mess with your seal up there. I'll just make sure that we're flush, and I'll just take this 1/4 inch drive ratchet and make sure that I'll run them 2 outside ones down and make sure we're flush. If you wanted to torque these to spec, you can. I'm just, when they're a small bolt like this, guys, it's got a paper gasket, I will just take a 1/4 inch drive ratchet and snug them up. Sometimes you don't have to overcomplicate this process. So, just want to make sure everything just kind of goes down and sits flat and flush, and everything's happy. Alright, so I got the oil pan dug out here, and what I want to do, I wanted to check something here. Our new engine gasket set, which I bought for an 87 Turbo Coupe Thunderbird, had a 1-piece oil pan gasket, which would be fine if it was still the old style, but this is a new style gasket that does not fit in these grooves up here in your front and rear covers. However, it is made to sit on top of them, and looks like it will seal fine. And I'm not a real big fan of putting any kind of sealer on any kind of these gaskets like this, guys. But I think we're going to have to put just a little bit in this groove up here. A little bit right here at these joining surfaces. And I think it will work otherwise. But there's one other thing I want to check real quick. And that is going to be our oil pickup tube to oil pan clearance. Especially since this has all been modified back here, we need to check it. And I prefer to check these with the gasket off. Because it's going to give us the max amount of room. And usually I will check this with a piece of clay. And I will take that piece of clay and sit on top of this pickup and take our pan and smush it down. But since we have our very, very nice bore scope, I'm just going to run our bore scope in here without the oil pan gasket on it, just to see what our clearance is like. So we got our bore scope out. I'm just going to run it in here and see if we have sufficient clearance. And looks like we got well more than enough in there. You want usually your oil pickup tube to be 3/8 to a 1/2 inch off the bottom of that oil pan. We're about a 1/2 inch with no gasket on it, so we may need to tweak that slightly. And by tweak it slightly, I mean give it a couple of love taps with a hammer. And looks like our clearance is a lot tighter now. You can still stick the bore scope in between it in there, so we still have about 3/8 of clearance. So the oil pan will probably put us, the gasket will probably put us about a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to call that pretty good on this application. This isn't going to be a extreme high RPM motor all the time, so I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of worries there. So I know a lot of guys sometimes in these situations to use the late model Ranger gasket, they will take and fill this with JB Weld and sand it down, and you know, a big bunch of stuff here. So what I'm just going to do, guys, I'm just going to put just a dot of RTV here at these seams that are front timing cover, not a ton. And I'm just going to take and I'm just going to kind of put just a little bit in here, just enough to build it up flush. We're not using this to seal the gasket, we're using it to provide more contact area, so to say. I don't really like that the gasket is made the way it is, but it is what Fel-Pro has decided to grace us with for this application. So I'm just going to take some of this Ultra Gray. It dries firm and hard. Like I said, it looks like I'm just globbing it on there, but we're just filling these drop down grooves and these caps. So I guess we are globbing it on. But it shouldn't smash out. That's what we don't want. I'm just going to, like I said, just going to get it up here close to flush. Not 100%, but close. Just where it gives it a little better chance at sealing with this big old gap in between here. I honestly don't see no problem doing it the other way, just putting it on there, but if I don't give this a little bit of attention, more than likely it'll leak. And I don't want it to leak, so you kind of do what you got to do to make sure you don't have an issue. So, like I said, just took it up flush on the front and rear back there, and I'm just gonna put a little high tack on here to hold the gasket where it goes, but a rubber gasket shouldn't need any kind of sealer whatsoever. So, like I said, just put the high tack on there to stick the gasket. Like I said, guys, this gasket's made to sit over them saddles front and rear, so the RTV was just a little bit to make me feel good about it, because I sure didn't feel good about how this gasket's made. I guess it's at least nice to see Fel-Pro has tried to update their design a little bit. So the high tack will just stick this rubber gasket down and keep it from wiggling while we put the pan on it. And the RTV should hopefully just give us a little extra protection about it leaking from the front and rear. Because like I said, it sits over the caps good up here. So it's got good overlapping contact. So I don't really see anything that should be an issue there. So and it does look like it's made out of a decent quality rubber, so that's another thing going for it. I was never a fan of their blue perma-dry gaskets, because over time they just swelled up and leaked and pushed out. So I am going to put just a little RTV in these corners, because rubber gaskets don't do real good at sealing corners, but they do good at sealing flat surfaces. And we don't really know how flat our oil pan is, so let me collect our bolts and we'll get this pan set on here. So a smart eye will notice I just put just a little bitty bit on the rounded portions. And yes, I know I ran about RTV. And you just don't want to glob this stuff on, guys. It's not bad stuff. It's bad users most of the time. So I'm just going to make sure we drop our pan straight down. And I want to make sure that pan goes straight down when I push this pan down. So that is one flaw I'm seeing with their fancy new gasket already. It did try to walk out over here. If we would have put these overlapping tabs in several places, then we probably wouldn't have that issue. It looks like they also revised it to take some bolt holes away, so when it comes to this stuff, the more the merrier on bolts. So if anybody from Fel-Pro's development team is watching this, you may need to relook at your gasket here a little bit, because it's 100% on the right direction, and you're missing a couple of bolt holes here, and you need to add some little tabs. I know I'm wasting my breath, guys, because you know these companies don't do this stuff for our benefit. They do it because they make a profit on it somehow. So I'm sure somehow this gasket is cheaper, or if it was more expensive, I'm sure they just done it to keep from paying out warranty claims. So just gonna get all our bolts started here. You gotta remember your four corners, take a larger size bolt. The rest of them are little small 10mm headed bolts. And I'm just gonna get them all started with my finger. And another lovely treat via our friends at Fel-Pro, the factory bolts for this will not go through these holes, because the sleeve in these positions is too small. And I'm going to assume this is probably a late model oil pan gasket, and it was just easier just to discard the one that fit and put this on there. So the solution I come up with, guys, and I'm not real happy with it, but I don't really have a choice with it, is to, I'm just going to put some 1/4" bolts through it, and instead of the factory 5/16 ones here, and just bolt nut through each side. I do that at all four corners. It will hold it. It'll look fine. Is it right? Nope, not at all. Is it what our friends at Fel-Pro have graced us with? Absolutely. Now, if you were doing this in your driveway, you'd be screwed at this point, because, yeah, you're definitely not putting one of these on with the engine in the car, because you're not getting the bolts passed through. Like I said, in this case, it'll be fine. It's not right or ideal, but it's not like we're modifying anything from a detrimental standpoint. And it would be nice to have they send a little paper with all their gasket sets give you any kind of update information on this stuff. It would have been nice to, you know, at least had a little blurb in it about the oil pan mess. But that will work. It's not 100%, and then you're missing this bolt right here and this bolt right here because it's not even punched through the gasket. I might drill it and go ahead and put the bolts in it too. So I'm going to put you guys on time lapse. I'm not going to make you watch me tighten all these oil pan bolts by hand, but that's how I'm going to tighten them, is by hand, because it's a rubber gasket and I need to watch what's going on. So guys, I got the oil pan on there, and I went ahead and put the fuel pump block off plate and the coolant temp sensor and the oil drain from the turbo back in it too, along with the water pump. So I'm going to flip around, I'm going to show you where I'm at. We'll go from there. So I rolled it back on its top. Like I said, I put the water pump back on it. This water pump that was on it, hopefully it's good. I put a new gasket with a little RTV around it because water likes to seep through paper gaskets, so a little RTV will take care of that. I went ahead and put our lower timing gear back on there. It's back on there. I screwed our auxiliary shaft bolt back in there. Put our oil drain back in. I've still got to get a plug to put in this one. That's your coolant in from the turbo. I got our plate back on there. I went ahead and, like I said earlier, I screwed that oil filter on there just to keep anything out of it. And I need to plug this port, and the oil dipstick hole back here. And then I can bag it for the night. Because guys, I know this video is definitely getting long at this point. So I decided to kind of cut it off here. I am going to flip it around real quick and show you what is upcoming for our next video for this engine. So hopefully, just stay tuned. So one thing I've not showed you guys, I remember telling you that I bought the head off this engine at a separate time from buying the engine itself. So I've got the head right here, and this has a S-slinger camshaft and stuff in it. I believe it is a 2744 or 4427 or whatever. It's the most popular one. I've got an S-slinger cam pulley for it too. So the ARP head studs, you know, a new timing belt set. I've got a 1035 gasket up there to go with this. So in our next video, we're going to work on getting this head ready and making sure everything's okay in it. Get it cleaned up and painted. And we'll get that head mated to the block at that time. It's been a long time, guys. The camshaft in the head is the old S-slinger, the popular one that everybody used to run. Everybody used to call it the 400 horsepower camshaft. It's got pretty decent specs for a 2.3 turbo. So, nothing mega impressive by any means, but it will have a sound and add a little bit of power too. So, I'm going to end this video here. So, if you haven't yet, guys, make sure you like this video, share them with your friends. If you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button because it does help the channel grow. It makes it better for me to bring you more videos like this. If you don't know, I am not sponsored as far as this stuff goes, and everything comes out of my pocket. And ways you can help, just hit that like button, comment down below, and hit that subscribe button. It's absolutely free, but it helps me out a lot. If you are a subscriber, I greatly appreciate you guys, and I look forward to everybody's comments down below. So until the next video, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you at the next one, and you'll see them at the next one too, huh?